Mendel founded the science of genetics. Before Mendel, asking questions about inheritance was not only fraught with error, but just ignorance, misunderstanding, even superstition. And one of the keys to Mendel's observations was that he noticed that if you had the two heterozygotes from the F1 cross, which had, say, one parent with purple flowers being true breeding for that, and one parent with white flowers, that in the second generation, the F2 generation, that this recessive trait appeared once again. But when he counted these purple versus white flowers, he found that the ratio of the dominant phenotype to the recessive was more or less a 3-to-1 ratio. And then when he did a cross for height of pea plants, or the color of the seed pods, or smooth versus wrinkled seeds, he kept getting this 3-to-1 ratio. And so at its heart then, it was the mathematics of this that said there's a pattern here. How do I explain this pattern? Now, when we explain the pattern, we can represent it a couple of different ways. I think for biology students, perhaps being more visual, I think we perhaps go to Punnett squares first. And so the Punnett squares can explain why there is a 3-to-1 ratio. After all, if we were to then look at the heterozygotes, there are two kinds of sperm. And if this sperm with the dominant allele fuses with this ovum, which has the recessive allele, then this will happen in 1/4 of the box. And in my Punnett square, notice that there are these 4 boxes. So we can do it this way. And with independent assortment, I'll draw a larger Punnett square in a second. However, you could also do this a second way. You could also then do it mathematically and say that this man makes two kinds of sperm in equal proportion. So half the sperm have a dominant allele, half the sperm have a recessive allele. Half of this woman's ova have the dominant allele, half of this woman's ova have the recessive allele. What are the odds that a sperm with a dominant allele will fuse with an ovum with a recessive allele? Well, you could say, oh, okay, well, it's one of the 4 boxes of the Punnett square. Or you could just use statistics and say, well, if this is 1/2 and this is 1/2, then the probability that this sperm will fuse with this ovum is 1/2 times 1/2, 1/4 of the time. The odds that this sperm will fuse with this ovum is 1/4 of the time. 1/2 of the sperm look like this, 1/2 of the ovum look like this. 1/2 for this category, 1/2 for that category. And so you could solve it mathematically. Now, given that it doesn't matter, in this case at least, whether the dominant allele comes from the mother or the father, then this individual whose dominant allele came from the mother is the same as this individual whose dominant allele came from the father. So if we put them together, then that would be 1/2 times 1/2, giving us our genotype ratio of 1-to-2-to-1. Now, you might say, okay, well, I guess you could do it mathematically, but isn't it just easier with these 4 squares? Well, sure. All right. Well, now how about, however, if we were to consider more involved genetics questions? Well, we could make larger squares. Okay, well, how about larger than this? Well, and I'm getting to this. This isn't the end of the explanation. But it's rather easy to explain this, because if we have 2 traits which are both following a Mendelian inheritance, where 3/4 of the F1 generation have the dominant trait, 1/4 have the recessive. Well, you could say, all right, well, what are the odds that you have, what are the odds of having the dominant allele for the first trait and a dominant allele for the second trait? Well, we could say, well, dominant allele for the first trait, that would occur in 3/4 of the offspring, and dominant allele for the second trait, 3/4 of the offspring. 3/4 times 3/4 is 9/16. 9 of these 16 categories would then have the dominant trait for both of the two conditions which we are considering. What are the odds that you would have a dominant allele for the first trait and a recessive allele for the second? Well, once again, if it's a 3-to-1 ratio, 3/4 times 1/4 gives you 3. 3/4 times 1/4 gives you 3. 1/4 times 1/4 gives you 1. This 9-to-3 to 3-to-1 ratio, it comes up statistically. And so, while in simple genetics, we might, make a lot of boxes with Punnett square and look at it this way. After a certain point, you're going to be wanting to test hypotheses statistically, and therefore someone who's going into genetics should, have some basic familiarity with statistics. Now, I think if someone's going into genetics, at some point you take a course in statistics, as you should. So this is certainly not going to try to, summarize all of the statistics that one might use. But before I, bring it all together and mention statistics again at the end, I would like to define 3 statistical rules: the product rule, the sum rule, and I would like to say a note about the chi-square test. And so when we evaluate hypotheses, we do use math, we do use statistics, and so therefore a genetics student should have some familiarity with this. All right, so let's start off simply with what's called the product rule. The product rule is a statistical rule that we will use when there are independent events and and I'll often use the word and. Now, what do I mean by independent event? Well, let's imagine that a couple has 2 children. Is the gender of the second child affected by the gender of the first child? No, it is not. All right, so if you ask, why is this child female or male? You don't have to say, well, remember their sibling, and because their sibling was male, this one's female. They have no effect. So they're independent events. And if I use the word and in my question, what are the odds that the first child will be female and the second child will be female? Well, we were going to use the odds of half and half. It's actually not the case as I go into it else. There's actually a bias towards males at conception and males at birth, but because of recessive alleles being more likely to be expressed on males, most miscarriages are male, most infant deaths are male. So by the time of puberty, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio. But let's say that the odds of having a daughter versus the odds of having a son are half and half. All right, and so if you ask, all right, so if this is the first child, all right, there are 2 options, male or female, and there are 2 options here. Once again, we're obviously treating gender more simplistically than it actually is. But if you were to ask, what are the odds of having a daughter as your first child and a daughter as your second child? So notice that they're independent events, that you have the gender of the second child is not affected by the gender of the first. And I'm using the word and. What are the odds that the first child is female and the second child is female? Well, this tells me I'm going to use the product rule when I've met those 2 conditions. And in the product rule, I will multiply the odds together. The odds of having a daughter as the first child is 1 in 2. The odds of having a daughter as the second child is 1 in 2. And if I multiply them together, I get 1 in 4. So if you survey families that have 2 children, 1/4 of them on average will have 2 daughters. What are the odds of having 2 sons? Well, if the odds that the first child is male and the second child is male, then you would multiply 1/2 times 1/2 and get 1/4. So if you survey families that have 2 children, a quarter of them will have two sons on average. If you ask, what are the odds that the first child is a daughter and the second child is a son? All right, so if you're specifying order, you don't have to pick the same gender for both. So what are the odds of this combination? The first child is a daughter, that would occur half the time. The second child is a son, would occur half the time. So that would be 1/2 times 1/2. That would be 1/4. All right, so a quarter of all families that have two children would have that combination. What are the odds that the first child would be a son and the second child would be a daughter? Well, that would be 1/2 for the first child being a son and the second child being a daughter. That would be 1/2. So those are examples of using the product rule, where you will multiply these probabilities together. And we don't have to stop at 2, for example. What are the odds that the first child is female and the second child is female and the third child is female? Well, once again, if the odds that the first child is female is 1 and 2, the odds that the second child is 1 and 2, female, the odds that the third child is female is 1 and 2, then we would multiply those together. So 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 would give us 1 in 8. So if you interview a lot of families that have 3 children on average, an eighth of them would have 3 daughters. What are the odds that the first child would be male and the second child would be male and the third child would be male? Well, once again, that would be 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. That would then occur an eighth of the time in families that have 3 children. And once again, you could mix the genders. So what are the odds that the first child is female, second is male, third is female? If the odds of each of these is 1 and 2. So once again, that would be 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2, etc. So here you notice the use of the product rule, where these are independent events. The gender of the first child is not affecting the gender of the second child. And I'm using the word and. And so what are the odds of this event and this event? You would then multiply the statistics then together. All right. Well, you don't have to use values which have half in them. So for example, let's imagine that we're looking at a dominant trait and a recessive trait in the offspring of 2 heterozygotes. Okay, so we know that there are 4 different genotypes possible in the heterozygotes. You could have 2 dominant alleles, 1 from each parent. You could have a dominant allele from your first parent and a recessive allele from your second. You could have a recessive allele from your first parent, a dominant from your second, or a recessive allele from each. Now, for our purposes, each of these are the same, but obviously those are 2 different possibilities which are indicated here. All right. So there are 4 possible categories, going back to that Punnett square. In 3 of them, you have at least 1 dominant allele and would then have the dominant trait. All right. And so whether this be something, silly and inconsequential, like if you're asking if 2 individuals who are carriers for having attached earlobes have children, what percentage of the children would have free earlobes versus attached, or could roll their tongue versus couldn't roll their tongue? I mean, this is kind of funny and cute, but it could obviously be serious. If these 2 carriers are heterozygotes for a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, what percentage of their children would be homozygous recessive and have a potentially fatal disease? Obviously, now this is a much more serious question that parents might ask. What are the odds that our children have this disease that we both, are carriers for? Well, if they were to have 2 children, 3/4 of the time, each of the children, both the first and the second, would have at least 1 dominant allele. So they would have the dominant trait, whether that be something harmless like rolling your tongue, or the normal condition of not having cystic fibrosis. But 1/4 of the children would then be homozygous recessive, and therefore they would have the recessive trait, either not rolling the tongue or having cystic fibrosis. And if you were to then, if they were then to ask, all right, if we're planning to have 2 children, what are the odds that both of the children would say have the dominant phenotype, would not have cystic fibrosis? Well, once again, here's the law of the product, in that these are independent events. The alleles inherited by the second child are not dependent on the alleles inherited by the first child. Sperm and ova don't run out, all right? And so, it's not as if there was, a small pool of sperm or ova, and once the first child gets, these, then there's a different number remaining for the second child. So these are independent events, and I use the word and. What are the odds that the first child has the dominant trait and the second child has the dominant trait? Well, if the odds of having the dominant trait is 3 and 4, so 3/4 of the time a couple who are both heterozygous will have a child with a dominant trait. And that would apply to both the first child and the second child. So the odds would then be 3/4 times 3/4, which would give us a ratio of 9/16. Once again, this was the rule of the product. What are the odds that the first child has the recessive trait and the second child has the recessive trait? Well, if 1/4 of the children have the recessive trait, the odds that the first child would have it would be 1 in 4. The odds that the second child would have it would be 1 in 4. This is the law of the product, so we would multiply them together. So 1/4 times 1/4 would give us 1/16. So if you survey children of carriers of a recessive trait and ask what percentage of the families have both of their children with the recessive traits, it would be 1/16 of the time. What are the odds that the first child has the dominant trait and the second child has the recessive trait? Well, if the first child having the dominant trait is 1 in 4, is 3 in 4, and the odds that the second child has the recessive trait is 1 in 4, then the odds of this would be 3/4 times 1/4, which would be 3/16. Likewise, if you were to ask what are the odds that the child would have the recessive trait for the first condition and the dominant trait for the second, I'm sorry, I'm thinking of independent assortment, which I was about to get to. My fault. If the first child has the recessive trait and the second child has the dominant trait, that would be 1/4 times 3/4, which would be 3/16. Now, let me just do one more video on this, but then you might realize, wait a minute, isn't that just kind of like the 9/3 to 3/1 ratio that we saw in independent assortment? It is, so I'll go back there. But here we are solving problems, and as long as they are independent events, and I'm using the word and, what are the odds that the first child has this trait and the second child has this trait? And then we could just keep on going. So once again, in that same example, if the odds of having a dominant trait are 3 in 4, the odds of having a recessive trait, 1 in 4. What are the odds that the first child has, say, the dominant trait? Well, that would be 3/4. What are the odds that the second child has the dominant trait? That would be 3/4. The third child having the dominant trait, that would be 3/4. They are all independent events. And so therefore, we would multiply these probabilities together. So 3/4 times 3/4 would give us, times 3/4 would then give us 27/64, okay? So there would be 64 possible combinations, but in 27 of them, that the first child would have the dominant trait, the second child would have the dominant trait, and the third child would have the dominant trait. Once again, 3/4 times 3/4 times 3/4 would give us 27/64. If you were to ask, what are the odds of having 3 children and all 3 of them would have the recessive condition? Well, then if we were to ask, if the odds of getting the recessive condition would be 1 in 4, then you would multiply 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4, and that would give you then 1/64 as the odds of having all 3 children with the recessive trait. And then obviously you could then ask other combinations, like what are the odds that the first child would have the dominant trait? That would be 3/4. The second child would have the recessive trait, that would be 1/4. And the third child would have the dominant trait. So whatever combination you ask, you would ask, what are the odds of this combination, that combination, then that combination, and then you would multiply those together. So 3/4 times 1/4 times 3/4 would give you 9/64. Okay. So all of these are examples of using the law of, the product rule. And once again, you can use them in different cases. So there you were just dealing with one trait, and you were dealing with different children. So you were asking, what are the odds that the first child has, the dominant trait for not having cystic fibrosis? What are the second? But here we're doing something a little different in that we're looking at 2 traits as opposed to 1, just cystic fibrosis. So you're asking, what are the odds that these flies have the dominant trait for the, or the dominant allele for the brown gene? What are the odds that they have the dominant allele for the scarlet gene? And if they have a dominant for both, then they'll have brick red eyes. Well, if it's a 3 in 4 chance that they have a dominant allele for the brown gene, and you multiply that by the odds that they have a dominant allele for the scarlet gene, so what are the odds that they have dominant for brown and dominant for scarlet, then that's 3/4 times 3/4, that's 9/16. What are the odds that they are recessive for brown but dominant for scarlet? Then that would be 3/4 times 1/4, that would be 3/16. What are the odds that they would be recessive for scarlet but dominant for brown? That would be 3/4 times 1/4, 3/16. What are the odds they would be recessive for both? 1/16. So then we see we can calculate odds by building Punnett squares and doing it that way. But these are based on statistics, and so we can then do it this way as well, which becomes more practical, obviously, as we get more involved in genetics. There is a second rule I would like to introduce, and that is what's known as the sum rule. The sum rule is what you would see if 2 events are not independent. And I'm going to use the word or to describe it as opposed to the word and. So what are the odds that in a family that has 2 children, that either both of the children are female or both of the children are male? So you're asking, here are couples that have 2 children each. What are the odds that they have the same gender? Either it's 2 daughters or it's 2 sons. Now, first, these aren't independent events, because if you have 2 children, all right, you can't have 2 sons and have 2 daughters. It's either or. So they are not independent. You can't have both events. In the previous example, you could have your first child be a daughter and the second child could be a daughter. You could have the first child be a daughter and the second child was a son. They were independent. But here you can't. All right, so you're either going to have 2 daughters or you're going to have 2 sons. You can't have both. So they are not independent. I'm using the word or. Okay, and so what are the odds that the first child will say both be female? Well, that's 1/4 of the time. All right. So 1/4 of the time, the first child is female and the second child is female. A quarter of the time, the first child is male and the second child is male. So what are the odds of having either of these two conditions? Well, now this is called the sum rule, because instead of multiplying these together, you would then add them. So if the odds of having your first child having two girls would be 1 in 4, your odds of having two boys would be 1 in 4. You would then add them together, and then the odds would then be 1/4 plus 1/4, which is equal to 2/4 or 1/2. Obviously, with a lot of these, statistics, instead of 9/16, you could then give it a decimal or whatever. We'll just represent it simply here with the fractions. And so this is known as the sum rule. And then obviously we could, use it with 3 children, et cetera as well. So what are the odds that if you have 3 children, they're going to be the all male, or they're going to be all female? Well, we remember from the product rule that the odds of having 3 girls is 1 in 8. So if you were asked, what are the odds of having 3 daughters? Well, that would be the first child's a female, the second child's a female, and the third child's a female. You would use the product rule, 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2 equals 1/8. What are the odds of having 3 children which are all sons? That would be the product rule. The first one's a boy, and the second one's a boy, and the third one's a boy. 1/8 times 1/8 times 1/8. But now what are the odds of either having 3 girls or 3 boys? Well, if the odds of having 3 girls is 1 in 8, the odds of having 3 boys is 1 in 8, you would now add them. This is the sum rule. And so 1/8 plus 1/8 gives you 2/8, which obviously you could reduce to 1/4 if you wanted. The sum rule could then also obviously be used with the cystic fibrosis examples, which I had used before. So let's imagine you have 2 children, and you're asking what are the odds that either they will both have the dominant trait or they will both have the recessive trait. Well, first you use the product rule to get the odds that they will both have the dominant trait. There are, if you're going to have 2 children, all right, and if you look at the alleles, you could get the big A from your father, the little a from your mother, and the second child, you get the big A from the father, the little a from the mother, etc. 9/16 of the time, both of the children would have the dominant trait. And we know that because if your odds of getting the dominant trait for the first child is 3/16, the odds of getting the dominant trait in the second child is 3/16. 3/16 times 3/16 is 9/16. That's the product rule. 9/16 of the possible combinations would have both children having the dominant trait. 1/16 of the time, both children would have the recessive trait. And you would get that because 1/4 times 1/4. Remember that, in a Punnett square, you have 2 heterozygotes. 1/4 of the offspring have the recessive trait. So 1/4 times 1/4 gives you 1/16. Now, if you were to ask, what are the odds that either you'll have 2 children with the dominant trait, they're both green, or 2 children with the recessive trait, they're both yellow, it would be 9/16, the odds that both children have the dominant trait, plus 1/16, the odds that they have both the recessive trait. So 9/16. Oh, I'm sorry, I screwed up. That's bad. I apologize. It should be a plus. My bad. So if it's 9/16 plus 1/16, that would then equal 10/16. So I'm sorry. That's the sum rule. I apologize. I never noticed that before. So once again, the odds that they will either both have the dominant trait or both have the recessive trait. I'm using the word or. It's mutually exclusive. You can't have both. So 9/16 plus 1/16 would then give you 10/16. You're adding them together. And once again, you could just make more complex questions as well. So let's imagine then you have 3 children. What are the odds that either they would all be dominant or all be recessive? Well, we know from the product rule What are the odds of having 3 children and they all have the dominant trait? Well, there's a 3 in 4 chance that the first child has it, and a 3 in 4 chance that the second child has it, and a 3 in 4 chance that the third child has it. 3/4 times 3/4 times 3/4 is 27/64. I use the product rule. What are the odds that the first child has the recessive trait? 1 in 4. And the odds that the second child has the recessive trait? 1 in 4. And the odds that the third child has the recessive trait? 1 in 4. 1/4 times 1/4 times 1/4, that's 1/64. That's the odds that they will be recessive. Now, if you ask, so you got this number by the product rule, that number by the product rule. But now if you're asked, what are the odds that either all of the offspring will have the dominant trait or all will have the recessive? They're not independent, and I'm using the word or. Then you then add those together. So 27/64 plus 1/64 gives you 28/64 as the odds of getting those events. So before I begin on the chi-squared, we use statistics in genetics quite frequently. Now, that's why genetics students should study statistics. It should be, a required part of their curriculum. And so obviously in one video, I'm not going to try to, to go through ANOVAs and ANCOVAs and all of the possible statistical tests. It was just rather introduce it, for some of the things that we will do. Now, I'd like to, just before going into the last topic, Mendel has these 3 principles: the law of segregation, the law of dominance, and the law of independent assortment. But I consider that this is almost as significant as those others, because prior to Mendel, if you ask why did that individual, animal, human, crop, plant, whatever, why do they have that trait? The answer was very often something which was not even biological. All right, a pregnant woman, had a rabbit run across her path, and the vision of the rabbit, holding the rabbit in her mind, that affected the development of the fetus, and that's why the child was born with a hair lip, because the woman saw a hair. All right, or why did that child have that condition, maybe a birth defect? It's like, oh, well, I'm not one to gossip, but that woman's uncle is a really horrible person. Did you hear what he did? And so probably the trait that we're seeing in that child is the result of that woman's uncle, and this is punishment on him. Or maybe there's a witch nearby who cast a spell. That's what people explained inheritance for. All right, I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, and it also, obviously, as we go back in time, people didn't understand anything about the natural world the way that we do now. But when you look at reproduction and inheritance, I would argue that the level of ignorance was far greater in that field than most. All right, this was rife with just misunderstanding and ignorance and superstition. And here came Mendel, and he said, no, it's math. I don't care if a rabbit ran across that pregnant woman's path. I don't care if her uncle is a mean person who should be punished. The odds of having, this number of daughters versus sons, the odds of having children with this trait versus that trait, it's just statistics. All right, so if you're both carriers, 3/4 of the time the first child will have the dominant trait, 3/4 of the second time will have dominant trait. And if we were to survey couples with 2 children, 9/16 of them would fall into this category. It's not superstition. It's not mystical. It's a biological principle which can be measured mathematically. And here's then the key. In science, you make predictions which then get tested. I think this. And then you say, all right, well, let me design a test. Well, if it's mathematical, this is beautiful. I predict that 27 out of 64 cases will look like this. That's so easy to go test. If it's not mathematical, it's like, maybe sometimes we'll see this. Maybe sometimes we'll see that. So even if you're wrong, it would take a while to prove that you're wrong. simply because, you haven't made this concrete hypothesis. Having, math involved is wonderful. And as we'll see later, all right, you say, I predict a 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. And then you measure the offspring and you don't get it. Well, that means there's something else going on. Maybe the genes are linked. Maybe they're on the same chromosome. Maybe there's something else happening. So if you didn't have a way of testing hypotheses, all right, you would say, oh, we kind of think this, yeah, kind of, sort of, we see it sometimes. No, it's like, we expect this ratio, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. We did not get it. Something else must be going on. Let's try to explain the something else. And so this, I believe, is often just underestimated as far as Mendel's principles. The idea of making it mathematical just allows for the testing of hypotheses, etc. Okay. Now, as I'm sure when you go through, lab reports, many of you have perhaps done this before. If you're expecting a certain ratio, I'm expecting a 3 to 1 ratio. I'm expecting a 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. Well, see, here's the problem. We know that even though odds are you have the odds of a first child being a boy or a girl is, say, 1 in 2. The odds of the second child being a boy or a girl is 1 in 2. If you survey families that have 2 children, not everyone has 1 son and 1 daughter. Obviously, a quarter of the time you have 2 sons. A quarter of the time you have 2 daughters. So it's true when you group a large enough population. So let's say that this is a 3 to 1 ratio. Let's say this is a 4 to 1 ratio. And let's say this is a 5 to 1 ratio. Now, if I'm not going to sample all of them, all right, then just by dumb luck, as I sample this, I might take a few more of the yellow individuals and a few fewer of the blue. Or by dumb luck, I might get a few more of the blue, a few more of the yellow. And so then the problem then is, how do I then distinguish between what I would expect, for a 3 to 1 ratio and a 4 to 1 ratio or a 5 to 1 ratio? How do I show this? And there are different statistical tests. With my classes, we'll be going through, Excel spreadsheets and the data we use in the lab. But the key would then be this. So let's say I count 100 flies or 100 people. If I'm saying it's a 3 to 1 ratio, then my prediction is that 3/4 are blue and 1/4 are yellow. So if I sample 100, then that's 75 blue individuals, 25 yellow. I have an expected. I've said when I sample this population, I think it's a 3 to 1 ratio. Then I'm saying that 75% will be blue, 25% will be yellow. If I'm predicting a 4 to 1 ratio, then I'm expecting that 80 will be blue and 20 will be yellow, etc. So each different ratio would have a different expected value. All right, so I've said this is what I expect to see. So I've expected values, 75 and 25. And then I actually go out and I count my flies, or I count the people in the population. I actually measure something. I have my observed. All right. Now, just like you would expect on average that couples might have equal numbers of sons and daughters. It doesn't always work out. It will if you examine a big enough population. But if you're only looking at your 2 neighbors, it might not work out. And so therefore, we are then going to then look at the difference between, here's, if I count 100 flies, I expected 75 of them to turn out with a dominant trait and 25 with the recessive trait. Here's what I observed. I observed 70 and 30 instead. Now, I'm not always going to get the perfect 75 and 25. And so now you would then calculate, put this into either a mathematical formula that you tabulate by hand. So I'm going to take my expected, my observed, I'm going to subtract them, find the difference, and then square it, and add that up. Or you're going to use it on a computer program like in Excel. You would say, now set up your bars and say equals chi-test these values, does my expected, how does that compare to what I actually observed? So in science, we use a value of 0.05, because I know if I sampled this one day, this population, I might by accident, just by dumb luck, sample a few more blues, the next day sample a few more yellows. And so if I sampled 100 days, sometimes I would, most of the time I would get the mean, right, where it is a 3-to-1 ratio. But sometimes I would see, more blues, sometimes I would see fewer blues, etc. But then I would ask, all right, so where is the point where, if it is a 3-to-1 ratio, I know that because I can count the whole group. But if I'm now going to just sample here and there, where's the value where 95% of the time, I'm getting this close to the mean of a 3-to-1 ratio. So if that's my real ratio, I can observe it in the whole population. And if I random sample, if I don't always get an exact 3-to-1, 95% of the time I'm within this range of difference from that 3-to-1 ratio. And then 5% of the time, then it's more distant, it's more different from the 3-to-1 ratio. That's then my cutoff. So I ask, when I measure my observations, is this what you would be likely to get 95% of the time? If it is a 3-to-1 ratio, you're predicting a 3-to-1 ratio, and if you look at what you observed, 95% of the time, would a 3-to-1 ratio give you this value? Maybe it's not exactly 3-to-1, but it's close. So what's close enough? What do we get 95% of the time as far as a difference from a 3-to-1 ratio? That's what we then use as our cutoff. If you're now observing something that you would tend not to get 95% of the time measuring this population, all right? So I should be seeing 75 and 25, but let's say I see 60 and 40. That's a big difference. How big is it? Is it, might that still be a 3-to-1 ratio? And I was just unlucky and I got a lot of, yellow individuals. Well, that's where you would use the chi-test. And after a certain point, you would say, no, this is a bigger difference from your expected than what you would get 95% of the time. So once it's more than what you would, a bigger difference from your expected that you would get, 95% of the time sampling a population where it was a 3-to-1 ratio. We say something else is going on. And so you have to reject your hypothesis. And so we'll be, my classes will actually be applying that in lab, and I'll continue that in something that's a bit more lab specific. But once again, just genetic students use math. And this was, just a quick introduction into the product rule, sum rule, and an introduction into the chi-test, which will continue elsewhere.